In the early 24th century, humanity had expanded its borders far beyond Earth. Space colonization was no longer an experimental project, but a consolidated reality. Entire systems were populated by self-sufficient colonies, initially governed under Earth's control, but over time, they developed their own cultures, economies, and identities. What began as a promise of interstellar unity quickly turned into fertile ground for power struggles. Earth's central administration maintained political and military authority over all recognized colonies. This authority was justified by the need to maintain order, security, and technological standardization. However, with every new wave of colonization, the physical and cultural distance between Earth and its colonies grew. Local autonomy was seen by many colonists, not just as a desire, but as a survival necessity. For Earth's rulers, any movement in that direction was interpreted as insubordination and a threat to unity. The spark for war did not occur in a major industrial colony or in a central system. It was born in peripheral regions, where the presence of the Orbital Defense Fleet was minimal, and where colonists had developed their own methods of sustenance. These distant territories saw less and less utility in obeying the orders of a distant, slow Earth that seemed uninterested in their needs. When local leaders began to declare administrative autonomy, Earth's response was immediate: military repression. In 2039, the first recorded rebellion occurred on Talos 7, a mining moon. Colonists, initially armed only with adapted excavation equipment, declared their independence and refused to pay taxes to the central government. The Defense Command sent a flotilla of frigates to quash the revolt. What should have been a quick operation became a military disaster. The colonists had turned the moon's orbit into an improvised minefield, using debris and explosive charges hidden in navigation routes. 3 frigates were destroyed, thousands of soldiers died, and the fleet suffered its first recorded defeat outside the solar system. Talos 7, however, was eventually taken after weeks of siege, but the victory came at a very high cost. This event revealed 2 fundamental truths. First, that the fleet was not invincible. Second, that the colonists were willing to fight to the end. The psychological impact was profound. On Earth, the population only received carefully edited official statements, describing Talos 7 as a strategic success, but behind the scenes, high-ranking officers realized that a new era had begun. Space warfare would no longer be defined by quick battles and instant glory, but by prolonged campaigns, high human and technological costs, and the transformation of entire colonies into permanent battlegrounds. The Orbital Defense Fleet was conceived in the late 23rd century as a direct response to the growth of human colonies beyond the solar system. Officially, its goal was to protect trade routes, patrol borders, and serve as a guarantee of political stability. In practice, the fleet represented the physical extension of Earth's authority, a force designed to impose discipline at any point in the galaxy inhabited by humans. At the height of the space war, the fleet consisted of hundreds of light frigates, dozens of medium-range cruisers, heavy battleships, and mobile orbital artillery platforms. Each class of ship had specific functions. The frigates were fast, suitable for interceptions and reconnaissance. The cruisers served as the backbone of battles, capable of sustaining prolonged fire. The battleships were symbols of power, mobile fortifications carrying enough arsenals to devastate entire colonies. Additionally, there were mobile logistics stations, capable of serving as repair, supply, and coordination points in distant systems. The fleet's internal organization followed strict patterns. The central command was in Earth's orbit, where the High Military Council established strategies and issued orders. Each regional detachment was led by an admiral, with limited operational autonomy, always subordinated to the political directives sent by the council. This created a solid hierarchical structure, but also a slow one, frequently unable to react with flexibility to the improvised tactics of the rebellious colonists. Discipline within the fleet was absolute. Recruits' training included combat simulations in zero gravity, psychological resistance to long periods of confinement, and intense political indoctrination. Soldiers were instructed to consider any act of colonial insubordination as treason. This model turned every crew member into part of a collective machine, where obedience was valued above individual initiative. For the officers, the goal was clear: maintain cohesion, and ensure that orders were executed without question, regardless of the circumstance. The initial campaigns revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of this structure. The fleet possessed overwhelming firepower, capable of imposing orbital blockades, destroying improvised defenses, and reducing rebellious colonies to rubble in a matter of days. However, this power depended on complex logistics. Each battleship required hundreds of crew members and tons of daily supplies. Supply lines became vulnerable to guerrilla space attacks, and small groups of colonists, armed with adapted technology, managed to cause disproportionate damage. Life aboard the ships reflected the harshness of the institution. Space was limited, rations were constant, and surveillance was permanent. Conversations were monitored, correspondence intercepted, and any sign of discontent was treated as a potential subversion. Many soldiers couldn't withstand the psychological pressure and were replaced even before entering combat. Official propaganda, however, insisted on portraying the fleet as an elite body, composed only of iron-willed men and women, dedicated to preserving humanity. The psychological impact of the fleet on the colonies was profound. The mere arrival of a cruiser in orbit of a rebellious moon was enough to generate panic. Selective orbital bombardments destroyed critical infrastructure, making it clear that Earth had nearly unlimited resources to impose its will. However, each attack also fueled resentment. Surviving colonists saw the fleet not as protectors, but as occupiers. This cycle of violence fueled the resistance, prolonging the war instead of shortening it. The first direct clashes unfolded not as large-scale engagements, but as scattered confrontations along poorly monitored trade routes. Convoys loyal to Earth were intercepted by colonial patrols demanding inspections. Merchant vessels refusing compliance were forced to dock under threat of fire. In most cases, shots were exchanged without formal reports being filed. Earth's High Fleet interpreted these incidents as isolated breakdowns of discipline. Orders were dispatched to reassert authority, but the response was slow and fragmented. By the time reinforcements arrived, the colonial ships had already vanished into asteroid fields or deep space shadows. The colonies had mastered hit-and-run tactics, exploiting knowledge of local routes that Earth's admirals lacked. The first documented battle occurred near the mining outpost of Vesta 9. A fleet of 5 Earth frigates moved to secure the station after reports of tax resistance. They encountered a colonial squadron of corvettes, lightly armed but faster. The engagement lasted less than an hour. Earth lost 2 ships, while the colonials withdrew with minor damage. It was a tactical victory for the insurgents, and more importantly a symbolic one. News of the encounter spread across the colonies with speed unmatched by Earth's sensors. To settlers, it represented proof that resistance was possible. For Earth, it was an embarrassment that undermined the image of control projected for decades. In the months that followed, similar incidents multiplied. Patrols disappeared without trace. Isolated garrisons reported being surrounded by civilian militias. Communications from outer systems grew erratic, filtered through colonial relays that conveniently malfunctioned. Each episode further eroded the illusion of authority. The High Fleet convened emergency council. Proposals varied from immediate punitive expeditions to cautious negotiation. Yet the consensus leaned toward force. The prevailing belief was that decisive displays of power would suppress the unrest. Few realized that the colonies no longer viewed themselves as subjects, but as rivals. The skirmishes of those early years were not strategically decisive, but they established a new reality. Earth no longer held uncontested command of space. The colonies, though divided among themselves, demonstrated that they could fight and survive. The war had not yet been officially declared, but in practice it had already begun. What began as scattered incidents soon escalated into a sustained campaign. The colonies, though lacking unified command, understood that hesitation meant defeat. Local militias were formalized into structured fleets. Civilian shipyards were converted into war factories. Merchant crews, accustomed to long hauls through hostile routes, adapted easily to military discipline. Earth responded with overwhelming deployment. The High Fleet assembled task forces meant to crush resistance swiftly. Heavy cruisers and carriers crossed the inner systems, projecting strength in displays meant as warnings. Yet every show of force demanded resources, escorts and logistical chains that stretched thin across light years. The colonies, operating closer to their bases, exploited this imbalance. The conflict expanded along predictable fault lines. Mars and Europa, heavily dependent on Earth's trade, remained loyal, though unrest simmered. Titan, with its tradition of autonomy, sided with the rebels, providing safe harbors and fuel depots. In the outer systems, smaller settlements declared neutrality but quietly supplied the insurgents. The Battle of Titan's orbit marked the turning point. A fleet of Earth warships attempted to blockade the moon, cutting off supplies. Colonial forces, reinforced by converted freighters, armed with rail cannons, broke the blockade after 2 days of continuous skirmishes. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the mere survival of the colonial fleet was broadcast as victory. From that moment the war was no longer hidden. Civilian populations on both sides watched transmissions of destroyed ships, evacuation orders, and lists of the missing. Recruitment surged, not only out of loyalty but out of necessity. Survival now depended on participation. Diplomatic efforts collapsed. Delegates sent to negotiate safe corridors were ignored or detained. Each colony interpreted the conflict through its own lens. Some as struggle for independence, others as fight for survival, others as chance for dominance. Unity remained elusive, but their opposition to Earth was shared. The High Fleet underestimated this resilience. Doctrines built on assumptions of technological superiority proved inadequate against a dispersed enemy willing to sacrifice infrastructure and populations for delay. Every victory cost resources that Earth could not replace quickly. By the end of the third year, the war had spread across half the charted systems. Earth still possessed the larger fleet, but control was slipping. Colonies had proven they could not only resist but expand the conflict. The struggle was no longer rebellion. It was war in every sense. The illusion of a single humanity fractured completely in the fourth year of conflict. The colonies no longer petitioned for autonomy. They declared themselves independent polities. Some styled themselves republics, others councils, others simply free systems. None recognized Earth's authority. The High Fleet responded with escalation. Massive convoys of troops and war material departed from Earth, aiming to retake key strongholds. Orbital bombardments, once unthinkable against human settlements, became sanctioned as military necessity. Cities under domes were targeted to pressure populations into submission. The moral line had been crossed. Colonial leadership hardened in response. Civilian councils granted emergency powers to military commanders. Propaganda networks broadcast messages of survival and defiance. Recruitment campaigns filled ranks with farmers, miners, and technicians. Entire generations were mobilized, their lives redirected toward war. The Battle of Ceres became emblematic. Earth's fleet attempted to seize the dwarf planet's industrial hub. The colonials, outnumbered, collapsed defensive lines and then detonated charges that rendered the facilities unusable. Strategic denial replaced defense. The message was clear: if Earth sought to reclaim, it would inherit ruins. This tactic spread rapidly. Outposts were abandoned after stripping them of resources, leaving behind traps and scorched infrastructure. Earth gained territory but lost time and credibility. Each victory deepened the sense of futility. Diplomatic channels disintegrated entirely. The few mediators remaining were ignored. In Earth's parliament, factions demanded decisive annihilation. In the colonies, speeches declared Earth irrelevant, a relic of the past. No middle ground remained. The rupture was not merely political or military, it was cultural. Colonials ceased to refer to themselves as citizens of Earth. Songs, rituals, and local identities crystallized around survival, apart from the homeworld. For them, Earth was no longer mother, but oppressor. By the fifth year, the conflict had transformed into total war. Civilian and military boundaries vanished. Every ship, every factory, every worker was part of the struggle. The dream of a united humanity had been burned away, replaced by a reality of permanent division. By the mid-phase of the war, Earth shifted to a strategy of containment. Direct conquest had proven costly and inconclusive. Instead, High Fleet Command sought to strangle the colonies economically and logistically. Blockades were imposed around major hubs, patrol routes extended, and interdiction fleets stationed at choke points. The siege strategy appeared effective at first. Convoys attempting to breach Earth's cordon suffered losses, and isolated settlements reported shortages of medicine, fuel, and food. Broadcasts from Earth proclaimed imminent collapse of the rebellion, but the colonies adapted. Smuggler networks emerged, navigating asteroid belts and gravitational shadows to bypass patrols. Civilian vessels were stripped down and retrofitted for stealth, carrying supplies between systems. Even as shortages grew severe, the resilience of the population hardened. Hunger and deprivation became instruments of propaganda, fueling hatred of Earth rather than submission. The siege of Ganymede illustrated the futility of Earth's approach. For nearly 2 years, Earth warships maintained strict control over the Moon's orbital space, yet supply lines continued underground through tunnels and hidden ice caverns. When Earth forces finally attempted a ground assault, they faced entrenched militias that had been reinforced despite the blockade. The siege ended, not with surrender, but with Earth's withdrawal. As the sieges dragged on, Earth's own logistics began to strain. Fleets dispersed across vast distances consumed enormous resources. Supply convoys from Earth grew vulnerable to ambush. Attrition became reciprocal, The longer Earth maintained its blockades, the weaker its own fleets became. Colonial propaganda turned these struggles into symbols of endurance. Murals, broadcasts, and even simple carvings in settlement walls declared survival itself as victory. Children grew up in scarcity but also in defiance, their earliest memories shaped by resistance. For them, Earth's flag was not authority, but by the 8th year of conflict, the strategy of siege had collapsed. Far from breaking the colonies, it had created populations accustomed to survival under duress, and fleets skilled in circumventing superior forces. Earth's fleets remained powerful, but their aura of inevitability was gone. The war had entered a new phase, one in which victory for either side grew increasingly improbable, but destruction inevitable. The stalemate of sieges gradually gave way to cycles of retaliation. Neither side could claim decisive victories, yet neither was willing to accept stalemate. The result was escalation, attacks on infrastructure, reprisals against civilian populations, and campaigns of psychological warfare. The colonies struck first. Small strike groups targeted supply depots on Mars and shipyards in the Jovian system. Explosions in orbital docks delayed Earth's shipbuilding efforts for months. These operations, executed with precision, carried enormous symbolic weight. Earth itself was no longer untouchable. Earth responded with brutal efficiency. Orbital bombardments were conducted against suspected rebel strongholds on Titan and Enceladus. Settlements were destroyed in minutes, leaving behind only scattered wreckage. The High Fleet justified these actions as deterrence operations, but among colonists they became remembered as massacres. The cycle spiraled. Colonists launched raids not only against Earth's fleets, but against loyalist civilian convoys. Passenger liners were intercepted, their crews interned or expelled. Earth in turn expanded rules of engagement, authorizing attacks on any vessel suspected of aiding the rebellion. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant disintegrated. One of the darkest episodes was the strike on Proxima Station. A colonial task force disabled orbital defenses and broadcast a call for defection. When reinforcements from Earth arrived, they unleashed saturation bombardment, destroying both rebels and civilians alike. Millions were killed, and the system became a wasteland. The event hardened colonial resolve, but also scarred their capacity to recover. Retaliation spread beyond battlefields. Sabotage teams infiltrated communication relays, spreading false orders and fabricated casualty lists. Families on Earth received reports of dead relatives who were still alive, while colonial communities mourned losses that had not occurred. The psychological cost was immense, eroding trust in every transmission. Over time, retaliation ceased to serve strategy. It became reflex, an endless chain of violence feeding itself. Commanders on both sides sought not victory but vengeance. Civilians caught between bombardments and raids endured losses with growing resignation. By the 10th year of war, retaliation had become the defining rhythm of the conflict. Territory shifted little, fleets remained locked in equilibrium, but destruction mounted endlessly. The war had ceased to be about independence or authority. It had become survival through mutual devastation. By the 10th year the conflict had lost all pretense of swift resolution. What remained was attrition, a slow grinding contest of endurance measured not in victories, but in survival. Both Earth and the colonies recognized that decisive battles no longer determined outcome. Instead, the war was sustained through exhaustion of resources, gradual erosion of morale, and steady infliction of casualties. Ships were no longer celebrated assets, but expendable tools. Entire fleets were deployed with the expectation of never returning intact. Colonial forces, specialized in harassment, small strike units, often operating with outdated or improvised vessels, attacked Earth's logistics lines. Their goal was not destruction of fleets, but cumulative pressure. A single destroyed freighter could delay Earth's operations across multiple systems. Every lost convoy meant shortages for Earth's fleets, spread thin across interplanetary space. Earth relied on its industrial superiority. Shipyards on Earth and Mars produced vessels faster than colonies could destroy them. For every corvette lost in an ambush, Earth replaced it with two. For every destroyed frigate, a new cruiser took its place. Yet this numerical advantage came at a cost: strained economies, mounting civilian unrest, and political instability in Earth's own governments. On the colonies, scarcity became a permanent condition. Food rationing reached extremes, and basic medicine became rare. Still, deprivation fueled endurance rather than collapse. The colonial narrative reframed survival itself as resistance. Every family that endured hunger without surrender was part of the war effort. The attritional struggle blurred the lines between victory and defeat. Battles were measured not by who held the field afterward, but by how much damage each side had absorbed. A system devastated by orbital bombardment could be abandoned 1 month and contested again the next. No gain was permanent. The cost of attrition fell heaviest on civilian settlements. Reduced to rubble were rebuilt with minimal resources, only to face destruction again. Generations grew up knowing nothing but shortages, fear and militarized existence. Childhood ended early, adolescence became couriers, militia members, or saboteurs before adulthood. By the 12th year both sides had suffered catastrophic losses. Earth retained technological superiority, but faced unrest across its population. Weary of endless conflict, colonies remained defiant but increasingly fragmented, some factions seeking negotiation, others demanding escalation. Attrition had not decided the war, it had only ensured that, regardless of outcome, both Earth and the colonies would emerge shattered, exhausted, and forever changed. As the war dragged into its second decade, the colonies began to fracture. What had once been a unified front of resistance splintered into competing agendas, factions, and shadow movements. The war had forged resilience, but it had also created divisions. Some factions sought compromise. Exhausted by deprivation, they opened covert channels to negotiate with Earth, proposing limited autonomy in exchange for peace. Others denounced these efforts as betrayal, insisting that independence was the only acceptable outcome. Between these poles, smaller groups pursued their own paths, smugglers turning into warlords, militias evolving into political entities, and local leaders claiming authority over fragmented settlements. In the shadows of these struggles, rebellion transformed. No longer a single movement, it became a patchwork of loyalties, rivalries, and hidden agendas. Operations once coordinated through central command dissolved into scattered actions, sometimes conflicting, sometimes aligned. Earth exploited these fractures, spreading disinformation, and covertly supplying rival groups to weaken colonial unity. The rise of insurgent cells marked a shift in tactics. Instead of large fleet engagements, colonies relied on sabotage, infiltration and assassination. Earth officers became targets in their own barracks. Supply depots exploded from within. Loyalist politicians were executed in public squares. The psychological weight of constant threat eroded Earth's capacity to maintain control. Yet the shadows of rebellion were not only military. Ideological battles raged across settlements. Propaganda portrayed Earth as a decaying empire, but also warned of betrayal from within. Families were torn apart as individuals chose different allegiances. Neighbors became informants, and trust dissolved into suspicion. The shadows of Europa illustrated this descent. Once a bastion of coordinated resistance, Europa became a battleground between rival colonial factions. Skirmishes erupted not against Earth, but between colonists themselves. When Earth forces advanced to exploit the chaos, they faced minimal opposition. The rebellion had consumed itself from within. Despite fragmentation, the rebellion endured. Even as factions quarreled, the underlying hatred of Earth remained constant. Every splintered group, regardless of ideology, refused submission. What united them was not vision, but defiance. By the 15th year, rebellion had ceased to be a single war. It had become countless wars over independence, over ideology, over survival. Earth still faced resistance in every system, but what it confronted was no longer a unified enemy. It was a shadow war without borders, leaders, or end. By the 16th year, command structures on both sides showed signs of collapse. The war had exceeded the lifespan of most original leaders. Generals, admirals, and political figures were replaced through death, dismissal, or exhaustion. What emerged was a fractured hierarchy, less about coordinated strategy, and more about survival. On Earth's side, High Fleet Command struggled to maintain authority over distant theater. Communications across light minutes and light hours introduced delays, making real-time coordination impossible. Local commanders gained autonomy, but with autonomy came divergence. Some sought decisive battles, others pursued attrition, while others simply tried to preserve their fleet. The once disciplined machinery of Earth's war effort became inconsistent, driven by personalities rather than doctrine. The colonies faced even greater disintegration. Without centralized leadership, militias and insurgent groups operated independently, often pursuing conflicting goals. Attempts to establish a unified council failed repeatedly, undermined by mistrust and rivalry. Commanders became warlords, their authority drawn from charisma or fear rather than legitimacy. The collapse of command bred chaos. Battles were fought without strategic purpose, launched only to maintain momentum or appease restless populations. Fleets engaged and disengaged with no broader plan.
Resources were squandered on offensives that gained nothing but casualty. One of the clearest signs of disintegration was the mutiny of the Seventh Fleet. Stationed in Saturn's orbit, the fleet refused direct orders from Earth to bombard a civilian settlement suspected of aiding rebels. Instead, officers declared neutrality, abandoning their post and retreating to deep space. Although Earth labeled them traitors, their defection encouraged further dissent among weary units. For the colonies, collapse manifested as infighting. Rebel groups turned on one another, seizing territory and resources from rival factions. Earth forces often advanced unopposed, not through strength but because their enemies were too busy fighting each other. In several systems, colonists themselves requested Earth intervention, not as submission, but as a desperate attempt to end internal conflict. As command eroded, discipline followed. Deserters filled hidden settlements, unwilling to continue fighting for causes they no longer believed in. Mercenary bands emerged, fighting for whichever side offered resources. Loyalty became transactional, and trust in institutions vanished. By the 17th year, neither Earth nor the colonies wielded coherent command. What remained was a war sustained by inertia, propelled forward not by leadership or strategy, but by momentum that no one could stop. By the 17th year, the war no longer resembled its beginning. Fleets that once filled orbital space with firepower were scattered, reduced to isolated squadrons, clinging to survival. Settlements once vibrant with rebellion or loyalist pride had become hollowed shells, their populations diminished by hunger, disease and displacement. What spread across the systems was not peace, but silence. Communications that once carried orders, propaganda, and reports of victory grew sporadic. Relays fell into disrepair, or were deliberately destroyed. Entire sectors ceased transmitting, leaving both Earth and the colonies blind to their status. Silence became a weapon and a symptom alike. In that silence, myths arose. Rumors of lost fleets wandering in deep space, of settlements thriving in isolation, of hidden arsenals waiting to reignite the conflict. None could be confirmed, yet all were believed. The absence of information carried more power than truth. For Earth, the silence was paralysis. Without reliable communication, coordination became impossible. Fleets held position rather than risk moving blind. Political leaders on Earth debated withdrawal but feared the humiliation of admitting defeat. For the colonies, silence meant fragmentation solidified. Local leaders no longer sought unity, they built insular domains, fortified against neighbors rather than Earth. The war had not ended, yet it no longer advanced. Battles erupted sporadically, but they lacked the scale or coordination of earlier years. Violence persisted, but momentum dissolved. What remained was stagnation, a war too broken to continue, too entrenched to end. The long silence was not peace, it was exhaustion crystallized into stillness. Populations endured, not in hope of resolution, but in resignation that the conflict had become the permanent condition of their existence. Children born in the 17th year knew nothing of life before war. For them, silence was not absence, but normality. The collapse of fleets, the ruin of cities, the disappearance of command, all were simply the world as it had always been. By the 18th year, observers no longer asked who would win. The question had shifted, not who held power, but whether civilization itself could endure the silence without disintegration. By the 18th year, the war no longer had a singular trajectory. What emerged instead were fractured futures, divergent paths, carved by isolated communities, leaders, and factions across the colonies and even within Earth's own domains. Some colonies embraced militarization as permanent. Entire generations were raised under conscription, their economies dedicated solely to sustaining armed forces. For them, the war was no longer a conflict, but a way of life, an inherited duty to resist Earth regardless of cost. Others sought disengagement. Remote settlements, severed communications and trade, retreating into self-sufficiency. These communities abandoned the larger struggle, declaring themselves neutral in practice, if not in proclamation. Yet their withdrawal weakened the broader colonial cause, leaving fewer systems committed to active resistance. On Earth, futures fractured as well. Political blocs debated whether to continue the conflict, negotiate, or abandon the colonies altogether. Civil unrest grew, driven by exhaustion and shortages caused by decades of war. For the first time, serious voices within Earth's leadership questioned whether control of the colonies was worth the ruin inflicted upon both sides. In the shadows of these debates, opportunists thrived. Smuggler cartels, transformed into ruling authorities over fragmented regions. Mercenary fleets pledged allegiance to no banner, offering protection or destruction for resources. In some systems, the distinction between rebel, loyalist and criminal blurred until none remained meaningful. Fractured futures also emerged culturally. Colonies, shaped by deprivation and defiance, no longer identified with Earth in any meaningful sense. Even those who sought peace no longer imagined reintegration. Generations had grown apart, separated not only by distance, but by lived reality. To colonists, Earth was a foreign power, alien despite shared origin. The war's legacy ensured that no single resolution could bind these divergent futures. Even if treaties were signed, they would fail to encompass the multiplicity of identities forged in conflict. Each settlement, each fleet, each leader carried their own vision of survival. By the 19th year, it was evident, the war had fractured not only systems and societies, but the very concept of unity. What remained were futures scattered like debris across space, none dominant, none stable, all uncertain. When the war finally subsided, it was not through victory. No banners were raised, no treaties signed in triumph. Instead, the conflict simply decayed into exhaustion. Fleets were too depleted to fight, settlements too broken to sustain campaigns. What remained was silence, an uneasy stillness spread across systems once consumed by fire. For Earth, the war delivered no empire. Resources had been drained, economies destabilized, and political authority weakened. The colonies had not been reclaimed, yet neither had they been fully lost. Control dissolved into irrelevance, distance erasing the notion of governance. For the colonies, survival was the only legacy. Entire generations had lived and died knowing nothing but deprivation and struggle. They had resisted, endured and fractured, but at a cost that reshaped their identity. Independence was not declared, but lived, born out of necessity, not proclamation. The war left scars deeper than the ruins of cities or the wreckage of fleets. It severed the bond between Earth and its descendants, transforming kinship into alienation. Colonists no longer saw themselves as extensions of Earth, but as peoples forged in defiance, defined by hardship. The silence that followed was not peace, it was an absence of authority, of unity, of resolution. Systems drifted into isolation, cultures diverged, and memory of the war became myth, as much as history. Future generations would inherit that silence, not as a pause before renewal, but as the foundation of their existence. The war had no victors, it left only survivors, each carrying fragments of a shattered whole into uncertain tomorrows.